Reviewing the Cold War, and we divide this into a couple of different ways. World politics, which we're going to see at the top, just a general overview of the United Nations right down here, and Canada's role as a middle power. And then at the very bottom, in a moment, what we're going to do is look at the major conflicts of the Cold War and the major players in the center, and then the new world order that was created. And then we finally finish off with a couple of facts about globalization. So to begin with, Cold War politics. The United Nations was created in 1945. It had 192 member nations. The General Assembly and the Security Council are the two main bodies that we had to know. Canada becomes a middle power in this time period. Now, a middle power means someone who's influential in world affairs, but they're not a superpower. And Canada joins the United Nations, and they attend every single peacekeeping mission that the United Nations has ever had. One of the ways that we know the Cold War has actually hit Canada is the Igor Gouzenko affair. Now, Igor Gouzenko was a Russian diplomat, and he defected to Canada, which means he went to the Canadian government and said, "Can I live here instead?" And what he said is, if you let me do that, I'll let you know that there are Russian spies who are living in Canada, and there was a Russian spy ring. This set off a bit of a red menace in Canada, where we realized that there were actually communist spies here, and it wasn't just a Cold War myth. Canadian defense. Now the students that filled this out put the DEW line, NORAD, and NATO. What you could also put in here is the DEW line, distant early warning line, the Pine Tree line, and the Mid-Canada line, and then you can be able to write those on a map where they are. We also developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, or not Canada did, but Russia did, and what that meant is a missile could be fired from anywhere and hit anywhere on Earth. So Canadians had to do duck and cover drills in Canada, and they learned that from Bert the Turtle. We also had the Avro Arrow project, which was so expensive that it was cancelled by Prime Minister Diefenbaker, and what this was a supersonic jet, the first and only one of its kind. At the time, Canada sold that to the United States, and in return we got Bomark missiles to protect ourselves, and it caused a bit of a rift. Diefenbaker to this day is vilified for having done so. We're going to look at the very top, the big social changes. When the A-bomb was created, it affected both politics and society. The Manhattan Project was where the A-bomb was created. Eventually they create the hydrogen bomb, which is even more deadly. So bombs actually rule life, politics, and affairs in the world. Brinkmanship is a term for bringing the world to the edge of war. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Prime Minister Khrushchev, the chairman of the Communist Party in Russia, and the President of the United States, who was JFK, John F. Kennedy, brought the world to the brink of war. And that's what brinkmanship is. Bring us to the edge of war and see who backs down first. Because of this, one of the social responses of having bombs where everybody could die tomorrow in a way creates the hippie movement. They say make love, not war. They protest in different types of music that they have. They believe in women's rights, environmentalism, and even civil rights. So there are big changes in this period. Another social change and political change that we're going to have to talk about is the arms race and the technology race. During this time period, both systems were competing for superiority. Which one's better, communism or capitalism? And to prove that, they created vast stashes of weapons. In fact, at one point, they could have destroyed the world entirely many times over. They also engage in the space race. If communism is better, they said, we'll be the first to get to space. We'll have better scientists. And in fact, they do send a dog and a monkey and a cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, into space way before the capitalist systems of the West do. And eventually, that's why the US lands a man on the moon to say, hey, we're actually superior. From the very outset of this unit, what we've looked at is the concept of superpowers. And what is a superpower? On one side, you've got the economic hitman, the USA, and on the other side, you've got the Red Menace, the beast from the East. And look at these two systems. While the West is represented by the United States, they're democratic and capitalist. And facing off against them is this other system. In the East, in Russia, you've got the USSR. They're communist and they're totalitarian. They control every aspect of everyone's life that lives there. In this West versus East debate, there is the term MAD that you have to know, and that means mutually assured destruction. And both sides basically said, if you attack us, we'll attack you, and the whole world will suffer. It's also a Cold War because they use spies, sabotage, and other cold tactics. There isn't much hot fighting between the USSR and the USA. If there was, it would have escalated into a global conflict that could have involved the destruction of the whole world. So thank God it was a Cold War. Some of the main events of the Cold War are below. They're the Korean conflict. The North invaded the South, and Canadian peacekeepers were sent in, and eventually Korea was divided into communist North and capitalist democratic South, well, sort of democratic South, and to this day it's remained the same. The Suez Crisis involved Israel, Britain, and France invading the Suez Canal because Gamal Nasser of Egypt tried to nationalize it. It was an important trade route to India, and what happens here is peacekeepers are once again sent in and they solve this crisis. The Berlin Wall was also erected in this general time period. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, where the U.S. spotted nuclear weapons in Cuba that had been placed there by the Russians, and JFK took umbrage to this and said, you've got to remove those, and we took the world to the edge of war, nuclear war in 1962. However, in response, the U.S. had to remove missiles from Turkey. One of the final conflicts we're going to look at is Vietnam. According to the domino theory, the U.S. thought if one country in Asia fell to communism, they all could. So they sent vast amounts of troops into Vietnam over a long period of time in order to stop communism. So it was the first televised war, something you should know about, and Vietnam was a complete failure in many, many ways. Canadians contributed by selling supplies to the U.S. The final conflict we're going to look at is Afghanistan. The USA had invaded it very recently in your lifetimes, but the Russians had tried first. They invaded Afghanistan and they lost. The U.S. did not support Afghanistan overtly in this war. They did supply troops and weapons, etc., weapons, because it was the Cold War. A complete failure. It was basically the equivalent of Vietnam for the Russians, and it proved that large superpowers still can't take over small countries. Then what we talked about was the death of communism in the USSR. And there were two nails in the coffin of the USSR and communism therein. And that was perestroika, which meant reconstruction, where Gorbachev, the leader of the Communist Party, basically said, we're going to change the way communism is. We're going to allow some private industry, etc. And glasnost, which is another Russian word, which means openness. He said, now our government's going to be more open, transparent, reasonable, and we're also going to allow criticism. And of course, once you allow criticism in a communist system, it's bound to fail because everyone's going to criticize it. After the Cold War ends, there's a new world order in 1991 and onwards. In the past, the method of intervention in countries where there were struggles was peacekeeping. Now, that's where the UN negotiates a settlement, like the Suez Crisis. So they send in peacekeepers who separate both groups and say, hey, let's find a conclusion that's amicable to all of us. And then there's peacemaking, which kind of marks the era where the U.S. dominates politics after Russia. And peacemaking is when you use force to punish an aggressor, like the Gulf War. So we send in tanks, we send in bombs, and we say, if you're not going to be peaceful, we're going to make you be peaceful. So some examples of the failure of the UN, however, and peacekeeping are Somalia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. Somalia, the U.S. Airborne Regiment tortured and killed a Somali teenager who was starving and took trophy shot pictures of it, and that really made Canada look bad on the world stage. Then there was Bosnia, a whole issue that we're going to deal with in just 1 second, and Rwanda, where over 1 million people were massacred in a very short time, and the UN basically stood by and was unable to do anything during this genocide. So Bosnia, the UN failed to help in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and that was in the crisis with Slobodan Milosevic. Eventually, NATO decides we're going to go bomb Bosnia and Serbia, etc., and get rid of Slobodan Milosevic because obviously peacekeeping is not working, and that happens in Serbia. The last thing we talked about at class then on our sheet was globalization and some positives and negatives with globalization. And what globalization means, it's the growth to a global or worldwide scale of commerce, etc. Because of great transportation networks, because of all the trade that we like to do, the world is actually a very small place now. You can get something, like an iPad sent from China or India, China very, very quickly, right? And some of the good things about globalization, as is that there's money for those countries that used to become poor. It forces people to become creative because they have to compete with people in other countries, and so there's lots more innovation. And countries end up working together, right, to design trade treaties, etc. It improves technology in general because there's more minds thinking about things. There's international exchange, products are generally cheaper, standard of living increases in poor countries. Some of the negatives of globalization are that Western culture usually dominates, so the values of the culture with the most money are projected upon other cultures. Sometimes there's a loss of job in Canada. If they can make cars cheaper in Mexico because they don't have to pay employees very much, they'll shut down car plants in Canada. Diseases can spread with more people traveling. There's a lot more competition, so you have to be globally competitive, which can bring down standard of living in better countries, but bring up, or in Western countries, but bring up the standard of living in poorer countries. The rich generally seem to get richer, and the poor get poorer in these cases, right? Now you can sell your products on a global market, you can make even more money. And so that is the Cold War era in Social Studies 11. Everything from globalization to conflict to superpowers to Canada and their defense lines.